The wind rolled low over the Montana plains, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and pine. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the jagged cut of the Absaroka Range, spilling streaks of amber and crimson across the sprawling land. Cattle dotted the far pastures like dark stones, moving slow and unbothered through the knee-high grass. To most, this place was quiet, forgotten, and aged, just like the woman who owned it. Ellie McKenna wiped her weather-cracked hands on the leg of her old canvas work pants and leaned on the handle of her shovel. 72 years old, she stood as solid and steady as the land beneath her boots. Her hair, once dark as raven feathers, was now a wild braid of silver and white, tucked under a faded camo cap. The wrinkles in her face weren't from age alone. They were lines carved by battle, storms, and sacrifice. From a distance, the ranch seemed typical, a wooden farmhouse painted decades ago in white, now chipped and worn, a red barn that leaned slightly on one side, a wraparound porch with a squeaky screen door, and acres of fenced land beyond. But what the eyes saw wasn't all that was there. Locals knew her only as Mrs. Ellie, the quiet widow who kept to herself. Kids sometimes whispered stories about her at the local feed store, how she once stared down a bear, how she never missed a shot at the annual turkey shoot, how she lived alone yet was never afraid. No one truly knew who she had been before she came back to the family ranch, and she preferred it that way. She pushed the last corner of the fence post into the new hole she'd dug and tamped the earth solid with the heel of her boot. The north pasture fence had seen damage during the last storm, and the cattle had nearly wandered onto county land. Ellie fixed everything herself, not because she couldn't hire a hand, but because she trusted her work more than anyone else's. Just as she was heading back toward the house, a truck engine rumbled faintly from the county road. Her sharp eyes cut toward the sound. She paused, listening. People didn't visit unannounced out here, at least no one with manners. Sure enough, 3 vehicles, a lifted black pickup, a mud-streaked Jeep, and a loud dirt bike, rolled slowly up the long gravel drive. Ellie didn't move. She stood with her hand resting lightly on the oak shepherd's crook she always carried. She watched the vehicles approach with the same calm alertness one might use to study a passing storm. The men who got out weren't locals. They were young, mid-20s to early 30s, dressed in cheap leather jackets, frayed jeans, and snapback caps turned backward. Their laughter drifted across the yard, coarse and mocking. One of them whistled low, eyeing the ranch with exaggerated disbelief. "Man, look at this place. Straight out of 1950. Another, tall with a scraggly goatee and a snake tattoo wrapped around his neck, kicked a rock and grinned. "Old lady living here alone, sitting on some prime land. Bet we could flip it in a month." The one on the dirt bike revved his engine twice, like he was announcing himself. Ellie said nothing. She kept a neutral gaze, feet planted like roots in the earth. They noticed her only after a few seconds. "Well, well," said the man with the tattoo, swaggering forward. "Didn't expect the scarecrow to be alive." His friends snickered cruelly. Ellie didn't flinch. "Trespassing's a bad habit," she said, voice low even, and aged like whiskey, especially this far from town. The third man, stockier, with a trucker cap and sunglasses he didn't bother removing, spread his arms. "Relax, Granny. We're just having a look around. Heard this land's up for grabs soon." "It's not," Ellie replied. The man with the snake tattoo smirked and spat into the dirt. "Everything's for sale to the right people." Ellie's eyes flicked over them. 3 loud-mouthed opportunists likely working for someone else. No farmer, rancher, or neighbor would come in like this. This smelled like small-town developers who didn't want to negotiate. They wanted to push. "Leave," she said simply. The stocky one scoffed. "We're not going anywhere. Couple survey stakes, some friendly persuasion. Place'll be ours before winter." The man with the bike circled in lazy loops, kicking up dust. He revved, trying to spook Ellie, but she stood as steady as a statue. That annoyed him more than if she'd run. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she'd done. They didn't know what it meant when her posture shifted slightly, her shoulders relaxed, feet square, eyes patient. They saw an old woman with worn boots and a limp. They were too arrogant to notice how her gaze missed nothing: the crowbar in the truck bed, the heavy boots for kicking indoors, the adrenaline twitch in their fingers. The man with the snake tattoo took another step. "Look, Grandma, just sign what we tell you when we come back with paperwork, or we'll make this place real uncomfortable." Ellie met his eyes. They were cold, empty of anything but bravado. She'd looked into eyes like that before, half a world away, through crosshair and sandstorm. "You boys should go," she said again, not unkindly. "There's more here than you're ready to handle." They laughed louder this time, as if standing their ground proved something. "We'll be back tonight," the stocky one said, pointing a gloved finger at the farmhouse. "Hope you got your affairs in order." The vehicles peeled away, spitting gravel and dust behind them. Ellie watched until the sound faded down the road. Then she turned, walking slowly toward the porch. Inside the house, the walls were lined with framed black and white photos from the ranch's past. But tucked in a locked chest beneath her bed were a different set of memories: medals wrapped in cloth, an old service uniform she rarely touched, and a custom-built rifle she'd cleaned 1,000 times. She'd hoped she was done with the world of violence. She'd hoped to leave that life buried under years of soil and silence. But hope didn't stop fools from making stupid decisions. As the last light faded from the sky, Ellie locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. In the quiet hum of the evening, she listened to the land. She had not survived wars and ghosts and betrayal just to lose everything to a handful of punks. Age had taken its toll on her body, but not on the instincts honed from decades in shadows and deserts. If they came back tonight, they wouldn't be walking into the home of a frail old widow. They'd be stepping onto the battlefield of a legend. The night settled over the McKenna ranch with the quiet certainty of an old friend. Moonlight washed the fields in silver, casting long shadows of fence posts and cattle. Ellie sat near the window, the soft creak of her rocking chair blending with the distant lowing of a cow. In the corner, the rifle case leaned against the wall, still unopened but no longer forgotten. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to a time before the prairie winds and ranch chores. A time when her name wasn't whispered in small-town gossip, but spoken in briefing rooms with classified clearance. Eleanor M.C. Kenna had enlisted in the Army at 19, against her parents' wishes. Her father, a stern but fair rancher, believed the land was a legacy she needed to uphold. But Ellie had always felt a pull towards something bigger, something dangerous and necessary. She'd grown up hunting elk in the mountains with her grandfather. She'd learned to shoot by age 7, track by age 9, and predict weather by the tilt of a hawk's wings. Joining the service wasn't rebellion, it was calling. She rose through the ranks quickly, her steadiness under pressure catching the attention of officers who rarely noticed anyone. She was small, quiet, and deadly accurate. While other recruits shouted and boasted, Ellie listened, learned it, and hit every target with frightening precision. By 24, she was recruited into a special operations unit so covert, most of its missions didn't exist on paper. Officially, she was a reconnaissance specialist. Unofficially, she was the long-range answer to problems no one could afford to acknowledge. Her code name, Raven. Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, the Horn of Africa. She moved like a ghost through places that shredded most soldiers from the inside out. Missions were silent, surgical. She never pulled the trigger unless it was necessary, and when she did, there were no second shots. But war had a way of stealing more than it demanded. She remembered the desert heat baking into her bones, the ragged breaths of soldiers waiting on her overwatch, the chatter of comms filled with fear and bravado. She remembered counting the heartbeats in the seconds before a kill, and she remembered the nights afterward, scrubbing the invisible stains off her hands. Then came the mission that ended everything. Her unit had been sent to rescue hostages from a compound near Kandahar. Intelligence was flawed, either by mistake or betrayal, she never learned which. They walked into a trap. Gunfire split the night open like a flare. 3 men from her team died before they reached cover. Ellie neutralized 12 hostiles from the rooftop before the evac arrived, each shot placed with precision carved from necessity. But one was too late. A young corporal named Hayes, barely 21, who'd carried a photo of his dog in his pocket. His breath had rattled out against her chest as she held him, hands slick with his blood. He'd whispered, "Did we get them out?" and she'd lied and said yes. The brass called her a hero. She called herself something else. She left the military with an honorable discharge and a body full of scars no one could see. Her husband Daniel had waited for her back home, steady, warm, the kind of man who could fix a tractor and sing Patsy Cline off-key in the same morning. He hadn't pushed for details. He didn't need to. He saw the shadows behind her eyes and loved her anyway. For a while the world was quiet again. They rebuilt the family ranch together, planting new cedar posts and replacing the roof after a hailstorm. Daniel cooked her breakfast every Sunday, and they'd sit on the porch in mismatched chairs, drinking coffee as the sun rose. Then, 5 years ago, Daniel died in his sleep. No warning, no struggle. The doctors said it was his heart. Ellie knew it was just time claiming what it was owed. She buried him beneath the birch tree behind the house, the one they'd planted together when they were young. Since then, the ranch had been hers alone, her sanctuary and her sentence. People thought she stayed because she had nowhere else to go. They were wrong. She stayed because this land was the only place left that didn't demand she be someone she no longer recognized. But peace, she'd learned, is fragile. The ranch had become valuable, not for its livestock or its heritage, but for what lay beneath it: water rights, mineral traces, and proximity to development. Rumors had started months ago, companies scouting land, buyers making silent offers, locals pressured to sell. Ellie ignored them. She had no interest in wealth, only in space to breathe. Then came the letters. Then the phone calls. Then the veiled threats. She handled each with calm dismissal, assuming persistence would fade. But men like the ones who showed up today, they didn't come unless someone sent them. Someone with money, arrogance, and no concept of consequence. As the clock ticked past 11, Ellie rose from the chair and walked to her bedroom. She knelt beside the cedar chest and lifted the lid. Inside, a folded uniform rested like a memory wrapped in cloth. Beneath it lay a weathered case and a leather-bound journal with names she'd never forget. She opened the rifle case slowly, almost reverently. Inside was a custom M40A5 sniper rifle, matte black, its surface worn by time but maintained with military precision. She traced a finger along the etched initials near the barrel, EM. A gift from a sergeant who hadn't made it home. Her hands didn't tremble as she checked the bolt, the sights, the barrel. Muscle memory guided every movement. She loaded only what she might need, not for killing, but for ensuring no one underestimated her twice. She wasn't looking for a fight. She'd buried too many pieces of herself in battlefields across the globe. But she wasn't going to let anyone take the last piece she had left. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters against the window frame. Somewhere down the dark highway, an engine revved, distant but approaching. Ellie stood, rifle slung low and silent across her shoulder. The land had called her home once. Now, it was calling her to defend it. The night deepened, thick and moonless, the kind that swallowed light and sound whole. Out on the far edge of the property, where the fence line met the old cattle trail, an owl hooted once and went silent. The air held that strange stillness that always came before trouble. Ellie stepped quietly onto the back porch, boots softened by age and habit. The rifle wasn't in her hands yet. She'd placed it by the door where it could be reached in 2 seconds flat. Instead, she carried a thick walking stick carved from juniper, her fingers wrapped around grooves worn smooth by decades. She didn't pace. She didn't fret. She simply listened. The first sign came in the form of headlights. 3 sets, creeping along the gravel drive without urgency. The same vehicles from earlier, the lifted black truck, the mud-stained Jeep, and the dirt bike. Only this time, their engines were muted, their lights cut as they neared the house. They parked crookedly by the barn, doors slamming shut, laughter echoing low and mean. The man with the snake tattoo, later she'd learn his name was Vance, hopped from the truck bed and gestured for the others to follow. He carried a crowbar like a baseball bat. The stocky one from before, Darren, had swapped his sunglasses for a headlamp he hadn't yet turned on. The third, Reed, the one on the dirt bike, had a backpack slung over his shoulder that clinked faintly with metal. They thought they were wolves in the dark. They were children playing bandit. Ellie slipped back inside and shut the door without a sound. The farmhouse was built by hands that knew survival. Solid wood, thick beams, doors that latched with a click you could barely hear. She moved room to room with practiced precision, extinguishing the few lights still on. The house became shadow and memory. Outside, the trespassers spread out like they'd rehearsed it. Reed circled to the east fence line, checking the terrain. Darren headed toward the porch with a roll of tape and a lock-cutting kit. Vance sauntered behind them, crowbar resting across his shoulders. "Kick the door, scare her out," Darren whispered, low but not enough. "And then what?" Reed asked. "She's old. She'll cave." Vance scoffed. "You saw her earlier. She's alone. You know what people like her do? They call the sheriff, maybe hire a lawyer. And you know what our buyer does? He buys the sheriff and buries the lawyer." They didn't realize Ellie was already watching from the darkened parlor window, eyes tracking their every movement with calm detachment. She noted their positions, distances, lines of sight, escape options, not out of panic, but instinct. Combat thinking never died. It simply slept lightly. She wasn't going to shoot them unless she had to. She'd buried enough men in her life. But she wasn't powerless, and she didn't intend to be a victim. As Darren knelt to inspect the lock on the back door, Ellie stepped silently into the kitchen and reached into the drawer by the stove. Her hand closed around a flare gun, bright orange, steel-tubed, hardly touched since the last calving season emergency. She opened the side window by the pantry with a near-silent push. Cold air seeped in. Then, without a word, she aimed at the sky and fired. The flare burst above the ranch like a blood-red comet, exploding in a fiery bloom that lit the entire property. It cast the yard in sharp pulsing crimson, illuminating barns, fences, vehicles, and the stunned expressions of 3 men frozen mid-crime. All of them whipped around. "The hell!" Reed hissed, shielding his eyes. Darren stumbled back from the door. Vance spun and scanned for the source. Ellie stepped out onto the porch at the same moment the flare's light began its slow descent. She carried no gun in her hands, only the stick. But the silhouette she cut in that light was not of a frail widow. It was something older, carved from war and winter. "You picked the wrong night," she said, voice level as stone. Vance blinked, recovering swagger with a sneer. "You trying to signal aliens, Grandma?" She ignored the jab. "Next one won't go up." Her gaze flicked to the Jeep's tires, then to the gas can strapped to the truck. "It'll go sideways." Reed and Darren exchanged glances. The flare still sputtered above, throwing red flashes across their faces. Darren stepped forward first, masking nerves with mock bravado. "Listen, lady. Our buyer wants this land. You're holding things up. We're just here to make it easy." Ellie's expression didn't change. "You don't scare me." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried. "And your buyer doesn't know who he's dealing with." Vance took a long step toward the porch, crowbar dropping to his side. "We're done being polite." Ellie didn't back away. Instead, she said something that stopped him mid-step. "3 against 1, she murmured. "And you still don't feel safe enough to come unarmed?" "That's not confidence. That's fear." He glared, uncertain for the first time. Then came the second sound of trouble, the roar of another engine, distant but closing fast from the main road. Reed cursed. "We didn't call backup, did we?" Darren shook his head. Nobody else was supposed to come. But Ellie turned her eyes to the horizon and felt a memory flicker. Grit, headlights, familiar timing. She knew that sound. A White County deputy SUV crested the bend in the hill, lights off but speed unmistakable. Vance swore under his breath. "You called the sheriff?" Ellie almost smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Didn't have to. Deputy Marshal Clay Harlan pulled into the drive like a man who belonged there. Dust trailed behind him, headlights dimmed. He was in his early 50s, a rangy man with a 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that had seen too much and said too little. He'd known Ellie for years, ever since he'd been a rookie who stopped by after hearing rumors of trespassers on her land. She'd fed him coffee and fixed his radio before sending him on his way. He stepped out of the SUV with one hand resting near his holster, not drawn, not relaxed. "What's going on here?" His voice carried the weight of law without needing force. Vance tried to recover. "Just a property dispute, officer." Clay's gaze swept the scene, the flare still hissing near the pasture, the crowbar, the cut padlock on the barn door, the taped handle of a pry tool half hidden behind Darren's boot. He looked to Ellie. "You all right?" She nodded once. "For now." Clay stepped between them and the porch. "Boys, you're gonna get in your trucks and leave before I write you into a stack of felonies tall enough to blot out the sun." Reed scoffed. "You got no cause." Clay cut him off with a look. "Trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, property damage, intimidation, probable assault. Don't test me tonight." The three men hesitated, the balance of threat shifting in real time. Vance tried to salvage control. "You don't understand. Our buyer is expecting." Clay's jaw tightened. "Tell your buyer he can go through legal channels like everyone else." Darren muttered something about being done with this dump and started back toward the truck. Reed followed, casting one last glare at Ellie. Vance lingered a moment longer, eyes narrow with rage and something new, curiosity. "You're gonna regret this," he said softly. Ellie met his stare with one honed by decades. "Son, I've walked through regret and made it kneel." He looked away first. They piled into their vehicles just as the flare fizzled out in the dirt with a final hiss. Engines roared to life, tires spitting gravel as they retreated down the long drive. Clay waited until the lights disappeared before turning back to Ellie. "You want me to stay tonight?" She shook her head. "I can handle the dark." He studied her, recognizing something old and familiar in her eyes. "I know you can, but this won't be the last of it." "No," she agreed, gaze fixed on the empty road. "It won't." As he drove off, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It was a pause before a storm. Ellie stepped back into the house and closed the door behind her. This fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And the men who thought they'd come to scare an old woman had, without knowing it, declared war on someone who'd survived hell and learned to build fences around it. Dawn broke over the ranch like a slow burn, washing the fields in pale gold. Ellie had slept barely 3 hours, but her body was used to running on less. She stood at the sink with a chipped mug of coffee, watching the horizon through the kitchen window. The world outside looked calm, but calm was often a lie. She'd already reinforced the doors, checked the barn, and walked the perimeter once before sunrise. The flare casing lay in the yard where it had fallen, a silent warning scorched into the dry earth. She left it there on purpose. At 6:15 a.m., a dust plume appeared on the back road, too early for delivery trucks, too steady for lost tourists. Ellie set down her mug. 2 vehicles rolled up the drive this time, the same black pickup from the night before and a shiny black SUV with tinted windows. The SUV stopped in front of the barn, engine purring like something expensive and arrogant. The truck idled behind it, a diesel growl vibrating through the quiet morning. Vance, Darren, and Reed piled out of the pickup, angrier, more alert, no laughter now. But the SUV door opened more slowly. A man stepped out, mid-40s, suit jacket over jeans, hair slicked back with the kind of confidence only money could buy. He wore polished boots and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His wristwatch alone looked like it could purchase a small town. He surveyed the property the way men in boardrooms examined maps they intended to erase. Ellie recognized predators in any skin. She stepped out onto the porch before they could approach the door. She didn't carry the rifle openly, but it leaned inside, just out of sight. The suited man clasped his hands behind his back and offered a politician's half-smile. "Mrs. M.C. Kenna," he said smoothly. "I'm Carter Winslow. I represent Blackridge Holdings. I believe we've sent you several letters." Ellie said nothing. Carter continued. "I apologize for the overzealous approach from my associates last night." His gaze flicked with irritation toward Vance and the others. "I prefer negotiations to be civilized." "You sent dogs to do your talking," Ellie replied evenly. "That's as civilized as a barn fire." Carter chuckled softly, though his jaw tightened. "I was under the impression you were refusing all contact. I don't like being ignored." "That's a you problem." Behind him, Vance shifted with poorly concealed impatience. Darren and Reed scanned the property, as if expecting backup, or witnesses. Carter stepped forward, maintaining the air of polite dominance. Let me be clear, Mrs. McKenna. We intend to acquire this land. Legally or otherwise, it will be ours. I'd rather write a check than a lawsuit. And I'd rather drink bleach than sell to a man who hides behind boys with crowbars. His smile vanished altogether. You don't understand what's at stake, he said. There are investors lined up. This valley is on the brink of redevelopment, lodges, resorts, new infrastructure. You're sitting on water access and mineral undersoil that— No, Ellie cut in. I'm sitting on the graves of my parents, my husband, and a century of work you'll never earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Vance muttered something under his breath, and Carter lifted a hand to silence him. The polished exterior was cracking. I'm prepared to offer you 7 figures and relocation anywhere you choose, Carter said. You could live comfortably the rest of your life. Ellie gave a dry laugh. I already do. Carter's voice hardened. Sentiment doesn't win against contracts. Contracts don't beat conviction, she said. Before he could retort, a shout came from the barn. Reed had wandered inside, and his startled voice carried across the yard. You need to see this. Carter, irritated, strode toward the barn with Vance and Darren in tow. Ellie stayed where she was, eyes watchful but unhurried. Inside the barn, a section of wall had been covered with a tarp for years, concealing boards Ellie had never bothered to paint over. Reed had pulled the tarp down, revealing a faded but unmistakable collection. Old military gear, shooting trophies, a photo of a younger Ellie in uniform beside a group of camouflaged soldiers, and a framed medal, silver star engraved with her name. Below them, laid across hooks, were laminated commendations detailing her record as a Special Forces sniper. Silence rippled across the men like a cold wind. Reed took a step back. What the hell? Darren stared at the photo. That's her? Vance's jaw clenched, bravado flickering into something uglier, fear and humiliation pulsing behind his eyes. Carter said nothing at first. He just studied the display, realization dawning slowly, like a storm that had now formed directly overhead. Ellie's voice came from the barn doorway, calm and unshaken. You boys thought I was just a stubborn old woman. She stepped inside, boots echoing faintly. Turns out I've retired from 2 wars, one overseas and one right here. Carter composed himself, but there was calculation in his stare now. Impressive service record. But it doesn't change the legalities. Ellie cut him off. It changes everything. She turned her gaze to the younger men. You broke onto the property of a decorated veteran. You threatened her with violence. You damaged her land. You did it at the behest of a corporation that operates off intimidation. Vance opened his mouth, but no words came. Ellie continued. You know what federal prosecutors love more than land deals? Cases involving veterans' rights, elder intimidation, and organized coercion. Carter's confidence flickered but steadied. You wouldn't take this to court. I don't have to, Ellie said. I already spoke with Deputy Marshal Clay Harlan this morning. He's on his way back, with a recorder and a federal contact from the VA. Carter stiffened, eyes darkening. Ellie stepped closer to the wall, running her fingers along the metal. There's a network of people who don't forget service. Men and women who make sure wolves don't circle the wounded. Outside, a vehicle approached, the sound of Clay's SUV unmistakable. The timing was not a threat, it was a sentence. Vance shifted uneasily. Darren's face had gone pale. Reed swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance dissolving into something like shame. Clay entered the barn without hurry, a small digital recorder in his hand. He stood beside Ellie, his presence quiet but immovable. Morning, he said to the group. We're gonna have a little talk about last night, and this morning. I suggest you cooperate. Carter's composure cracked. This is harassment. Clay didn't blink. No, sir. This is evidence collection. He pointed to the truck and SUV. Keys on the hood, phones in a pile, hands where I can see 'em. You can call your lawyers after we're done. For the first time since arriving, Carter hesitated and obeyed. Vance followed, though he glared daggers at Ellie. Darren and Reed moved with the shaky compliance of men who'd just realized the cliff they'd walked off. Ellie said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't threaten. She simply stood with the quiet certainty of someone who'd faced far worse enemies and didn't need to raise her voice to win. As Clay began collecting statements and reading rights, the sun climbed higher, casting long slants of light through the barn slats. Dust motes drifted through the beams, settling over old memories and new reckonings. The men who had come to take her land now looked like what they were, intruders in a place that had already outlived them. Ellie stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The weight on her shoulders had not vanished, but it had shifted. No longer defense, now preparation. This fight was not finished, but she had drawn the line in ground soaked with history and resolve, and the world was finally remembering who she was. By late afternoon, the sheriff's office looked more like a hornet's nest than a small town department. Carter Winslow, Vance, Darren, and Reed were separated and questioned. Clay Harlan made sure every word, every threat, every detail from the past 24 hours was recorded and archived. The VA representative Clay had contacted, retired Colonel Andrea Palmer, arrived before noon. She was a compact woman with iron gray hair and a stare that cut through lies faster than a blade through rope. When she asked Ellie privately if she wanted to press federal charges under the Elder Justice Act and Veteran Protection Statutes, Ellie hesitated only long enough to choose a path that would have lasting consequences. "Yes," she said, "but I want the man funding this held accountable, not just the hired fools." Clay and Colonel Palmer exchanged a glance that said more than words. "We'll make that happen." By evening, Judge Harris, an old rancher himself, had signed emergency orders blocking any future acquisition attempts on Ellie's land until a full investigation concluded. Clay made sure copies were delivered to the courthouse, sheriff's office, district attorney, and federal channels before nightfall. The town started talking before the sun even set. At Bennett's Feed and Grain, men in canvas jackets muttered, "They messed with the wrong woman." At the diner, folks shook their heads in disbelief. Some had always suspected she was more than a quiet widow, but few had imagined the truth. No one doubted it now. By the time the streetlights flickered on, Ellie was back home. She walked the perimeter again, not out of fear, but out of habit. Peace had to be watched, tended, and guarded like cattle or crops. Near the birch tree where her husband was buried, she paused. The wind stirred the branches gently. She rested a hand on the weathered trunk. "You'd have had something clever to say about all this," she murmured to the earth. "Probably would have told me not to shoot anyone unless they deserved it." The quiet that followed was soft, not heavy. She returned to the house and brewed tea instead of coffee this time, allowing herself the small luxury of a long exhale. The rifle was back in its case, oiled and secured. The flare gun returned to its drawer, but nothing was quite the same. At 7:40 p.m., Deputy Clay's SUV rolled up the drive again. He stepped out holding a folder and a thermos. Ellie met him on the porch. "Brought you something," he said, handing her the thermos. "Chamomile. My wife swears it fixes everything short of a car crash." Ellie gave the faintest ghost of a smile. "Tell her I appreciate the prescription." Clay leaned against a porch post, the folder tucked under his arm. "Thought you'd want an update. Carter's flipping like a fish on a deck. Claims someone higher up pushed him into this. We'll find out who." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "He gave you a name?" Clay nodded. "We'll verify it, but it lines up with some of the shell company paperwork your lawyer friend faxed over." She blinked once. "I don't have a lawyer." "Not yet," Clay said. "But 2 of them called me today, asking to represent you pro bono. Word gets out fast when a war hero nearly brings down a land syndicate before breakfast." Ellie didn't relish attention. But justice wasn't always quiet, and sometimes light needed to be shone on rot before it could be scraped out. Clay lifted the folder. "Also, local paper wants a quote. I told them to go through Colonel Palmer unless you want to talk to reporters yourself." "I don't," Ellie said. "Figured." He lingered a moment, looking out over the fields bathed in twilight. "You know, doesn't have to stay just you out here forever." She angled him a look. "You offering to move in and fix fences?" He snorted. "I was thinking more along the lines of getting you some ranch hands, folks who'd respect the land, veterans maybe, or kids needing purpose." The idea landed softly in her chest, not intrusive, not unwelcome, just unexpected. "You think they'd come?" she asked. Clay nodded. For someone like you, they already are. He tipped his hat and left her with the folder. But Ellie didn't open it yet. She watched his taillights fade into the dark, then stepped back inside. The house felt different tonight. Not bigger, not safer, just less burdened. She poured a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching stars blink into existence across the sky. Somewhere in the trees beyond the pasture, coyotes called to each other, their voices rolling over the land like music from the edges of time. She closed her eyes and listened. Weeks later, the investigation made headlines across the state. Veteran sniper foils illegal land grab. Elder rancher exposes corrupt development scheme, decorated soldier faces down trespassers. Sparks federal probe. Ellie didn't read most of them. She was too busy putting her land back in order. Deputy Clay visited often, not out of duty anymore, but out of something like respect and maybe quiet friendship. Colonel Palmer called to inform her that federal charges were being filed not only against Carter Winslow but against Blackridge's financial backer, a real estate magnate under prior investigation. Vance, Darren, and Reed accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony. Their arrogance collapsed under the weight of consequences and the stark realization that they'd underestimated someone whose life had been built on surviving impossible odds. But none of that brought Ellie the same satisfaction as the knock on her door one crisp morning in early spring. A young woman stood on the porch, mid-20s, hair in a tight braid, wearing worn boots and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. "You don't know me," she said, voice steady. "Name's Kara Jensen. Sergeant, I did 2 tours in Syria. I heard you might be looking for a ranch hand with steady aim and no patience for bullies." Ellie studied her a long moment, then opened the screen door wider. "You ride a horse?" "Like breathing," Kara said. "You drink coffee strong enough to peel paint?" "Only kind worth drinking." Ellie nodded. "There's fencing needs replacing on the north pasture. Start there tomorrow. I pay fair and don't tolerate laziness." Kara smiled. "Understood, ma'am." As the young veteran walked toward the bunkhouse that hadn't housed anyone in 10 years, Ellie watched her with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope shaped like continuity. The world would keep coming with its teeth and ambition, but the ranch wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she.